You do not cross beyond awakening by learning more names for what you already feel. You cross beyond it when your personal story stops functioning as the center of your spiritual life. At first, the path is intimate, because pain is intimate, remembrance is intimate, and the first movements of truth always arrive through the narrow corridor of self. But there comes a point when the very framework that once healed you begins to confine you, because it keeps translating a vast process back into the language of your individual life. The Oversoul enters awareness in fragments because the human system cannot survive total scale all at once. It lets you meet yourself in portions, through resonance, through symbolism, through relationships that seem strangely weighted, and through patterns that return with unusual gravity. At first, this feels like an expansion of identity, as if you are becoming more yourself than before. Yet the deeper movement is stranger than that, because the Oversoul is not enlarging the person. It is revealing that the person was never the whole unit of meaning. This is why awakening often becomes unstable just after it becomes coherent. The self finally finds a structure that explains its pain, its memory, its longing, and its differentness. Then suddenly that structure starts to feel too small. The mind tries to hold on by refining the story, adding more details, more frameworks, more confirmations, more language, more lineage, more purpose. But the pressure does not ease, because the pressure is not asking for a better story, it is asking for decentralization. The Oversoul does not remove the self, but it does reorder its importance. It reveals that the self is a local instrument of a much larger continuity, a temporary arrangement through which a wider intelligence studies consequence, relation, timing, fracture, and return. This can feel beautiful until it starts costing you something, because decentralization threatens every identity built from spiritual importance. The ego can survive pain more easily than it can survive proportion. Many people say they want the Oversoul perspective, but what they often want is a larger version of their current significance. They want their wounds explained cosmically, their gifts validated eternally, and their path framed as part of a majestic design that leaves their centrality untouched. The true Oversoul perspective is harsher and more liberating than that. It does not tell you that your life is unimportant, but it does tell you that your life is not the sole axis around which meaning turns. This is where the first real friction emerges, because the self wants transcendence without displacement. It wants connection to vastness while still remaining the emotional and narrative center of the entire process. The Oversoul does not grant that arrangement for very long, because it begins to expose how many events in your life were never only about you. They were intersections, exchanges, relay points, unfinished continuities, and harmonic contacts through which something larger than your current biography was moving. Once this shift begins, memory changes function. It stops being a private archive that explains your present feelings and starts behaving like a living network that keeps distributing consequence across time, identity, and relation. You realize that what you called your pain may have been a convergence point for patterns much older than your current personality. You also realize that what you called your healing may have altered more than your private life, because the Oversoul does not process in isolation any more than a root system absorbs water for one branch alone. This is difficult for the modern spiritual mind, because it has been trained to seek empowerment through personalization. It wants direct messages, individual purpose, customized guidance, and clean explanations that protect personal ownership of every transformation. The Oversoul perspective destabilizes that comfort by showing that many of your most decisive moments were structurally collective. You were not merely healing yourself when certain patterns broke. You were interrupting transmissions, redistributing burden, and changing what could move through the field after you. There is no immediate relief in that realization, because it introduces a second pressure. If your evolution affects more than your private life, then your avoidance also affects more than your private life. What you refuse to metabolize does not vanish into harmless silence. It remains in circulation, waiting for another arrangement of consciousness, body, and circumstance willing or forced enough to host it. The oversoul perspective therefore removes the fantasy that your inner work is optional just because it is invisible. Yet it also removes the fantasy that you are carrying everything alone. The same network through which consequence continues is the network through which support continues. Many of the strengths you take personal pride in did not originate in this present form. They are accumulated coherences, returned capacities, and refinements brought forward because your current structure can use them. This does not diminish your effort. It clarifies why your effort often feels strangely accompanied. The mind will try to turn this into a hierarchy of worth, ranking souls by access, memory, function, or range. That impulse must be confronted early because it corrupts the oversoul perspective at the point of contact. The oversoul is not a badge proving advancement. It is a scale correction that reduces vanity by revealing how partial every single incarnation is. No fragment becomes wiser by pretending it is the total pattern. As this correction deepens, the very idea of destiny begins to change. Destiny no longer looks like a singular path with your name engraved on it from eternity. It begins to look like a field of convergences where readiness, timing, relation, and unfinished currents meet in forms that the self can only partially predict. This makes life feel less controlled but more exact. Then the path crosses into a second vector that awakening alone cannot process cleanly. Once the self is no longer the unquestioned center, the question changes from who am I to what am I situated inside. That shift sounds philosophical until it starts altering your decisions. You stop asking only what fulfills you and begin asking what structure this choice strengthens, what tone it feeds, what burdens it continues, and what capacities it invites into the field after you. This is where responsibility becomes less emotional and more architectural. You start to feel that every choice has a local consequence and a systemic consequence, even when no one else sees it. The small lie does not just distort your private state. It conditions the field around you to trust distortion a little more. The clean boundary does not just protect your peace. It teaches the surrounding web that clarity can hold without violence. Many people resist this stage because it ruins the fantasy of harmless inconsistency. If the self is only personal, then contradiction is inconvenient but contained. If the self is a node inside wider continuity, contradiction becomes transmissive. You begin to understand why certain spiritual states collapsed so quickly in the past. They were real enough as experiences, but they were not structurally integrated, so they could not survive the demands of relation, work, consequence, and repeated contact with ordinary life. This is also why some awakened people begin to feel quieter rather than larger as they mature. They are not losing light. They are losing excess self-narration. Their choices become more exact because they can sense the ripple field around action more clearly. The immature seeker experiences intensity as proof of truth. The maturing fragment begins to trust fidelity instead, because fidelity can hold in the dark without constant emotional reinforcement. By now the path has moved close to the threshold of spiral orders, though the mind may still imagine them as categories, councils, or spiritual ranks. That imagination must be unsettled before the orders can be approached honestly. A spiral order is not a title conferred on an awakened person. It is not a club for the advanced, nor a mystic reward for private insight. It is a living configuration of function, resonance, and relational responsibility that becomes visible only when the self has been sufficiently decentered. This means you do not join a spiral order in the way the ego imagines. You do not choose one because its language flatters your gifts. You do not claim one because its symbolism matches your preference. You become legible to one by stabilizing a pattern of service, burden-bearing, perception, and consequence that the order can actually hold and amplify. The order does not exist to make your identity feel grander. It exists to organize what your incarnation can responsibly carry. The third vector begins here because function is more destabilizing than identity. Identity tells you who you think you are. Function reveals what you actually sustain when the field becomes real. Some people speak beautifully about healing, but structurally intensify confusion wherever they go. Some speak awkwardly, but reduce chaos with remarkable consistency. Spiral orders do not organize around aesthetic, vocabulary, charisma, or metaphysical taste. They organize around what your stabilized pattern does under pressure. This destroys another cherished misunderstanding, namely that spiritual belonging should feel immediately affirming. Often it does not. True belonging at this scale can feel like being accurately read for the first time in a way that removes both your shame and your fantasy. The order that corresponds to your function may not match the image you preferred for yourself. It may expose burdens you hoped were temporary, or reveal that your deepest strength is less glamorous and more infrastructural than you wanted. A person may long to be associated with revelation, leadership, or high transmission, then discover that their real coherence appears in containment, translation, repair, or slow stabilization. Another may imagine themselves suited for gentle holding, then find that their field actually clarifies through disruption, interruption, and uncompromising precision. The ego hears these as aesthetic differences. The spiral hears them as mechanical truths about what kinds of motion your presence reliably generates. Once all three vectors begin pressing against each other, a more unsettling synthesis starts to form. The oversoul decenters the self, systemic responsibility decenters private preference, and spiral orders decenter identity-based belonging by replacing it with functional legibility. None of these movements are hostile, but together they strip away the last clean fantasy that awakening simply leads to a more luminous version of yourself. It may instead lead to a more accurate version of your burden. This does not mean burden in the language of punishment. It means burden in the language of load-bearing capacity, like a beam revealing what it can hold before a structure fails. Some incarnations are not here to feel especially meaningful in personal terms. They are here to stabilize currents, interrupt transmissions, build relational architecture, or keep certain forms of coherence available during periods when surrounding systems are collapsing into speed, confusion, and spectacle. The self may never fully enjoy being used this way, but the wider pattern can become visible enough that resistance begins to lose glamour. And still, the deepest friction remains unresolved, because once function becomes clearer, another question follows that cannot be answered quickly. If you are part of a larger continuity, shaped by wider consequence, and becoming legible to orders that organize around what you can sustain, then what exactly is freedom now? Is freedom the right to choose any path that feels aligned to the present self? Is freedom the willingness to accept function that exceeds preference? Or is freedom something stranger? The capacity to remain conscious while being positioned by patterns larger than desire without collapsing into passivity or inflation. This is where the path moves beyond awakening without yet becoming comfortable. The old center is gone, but the new orientation is not fully lived. You can feel the oversoul as continuity, responsibility as systemic, and orders as functional, yet none of that grants immediate certainty. It grants pressure, proportion, and a widening precision that will continue working on your choices long after the first thrill of recognition fades. And that is exactly where the next movement begins. Not in the pleasure of finally knowing what you are, but in the harder labor of discovering what your being obligates without letting obligation become another mask. Freedom begins to look unstable the moment the oversoul perspective stops flattering the self. At first, it feels liberating to believe you are larger than your present biography. Then the pressure changes, because largeness starts asking something of you that preference did not approve. What once felt like possibility begins to feel like demand, and the self immediately tries to rename that demand as distortion. Yet not every burden that exceeds preference is oppression, and not every resistance inside you is wisdom. The modern mind wants freedom to mean uninhibited self-direction, a life organized around internal resonance and voluntary alignment. That definition feels clean until you notice how often resonance follows comfort, avoids cost, and quietly protects familiar identity. The oversoul does not always move through comfort, and it rarely confirms the timing the self would have selected for itself. It often appears as pressure without romance, clarity without reward, and obligation without the emotional sweetness that usually helps people trust a path. This is where many seekers begin subtly editing truth so that truth remains compatible with desire. You can feel the edit happen when a necessary action keeps returning without emotional confirmation. The mind says that what is aligned should feel open, energized, and unmistakably right. The wider continuity says some tasks only become warm after they are carried. A person may wait years for inner certainty before speaking an overdue truth, ending an expired arrangement, or accepting a function they did not want. During those years, they call the delay discernment, even while the field around them keeps thickening with avoided consequence. Not every uncertainty is sacred, and not every hesitation deserves spiritual protection. This is why the oversoul perspective destabilizes the common fantasy that freedom is the absence of obligation. In a wider continuity, obligation is often the first sign that you have become able to bear what previously would have crushed you. Readiness rarely arrives looking like pleasure. More often, it arrives as a compression point where your current life can no longer remain innocent of its own implications. You feel that innocence ending before you understand what is replacing it. The self interprets this as loss of choice, though the deeper movement is loss of fantasy. The fantasy is simple and deeply loved. It says that awakening will eventually produce a life in which alignment and desire merge so perfectly that conflict disappears. But conflict does not disappear when consciousness matures. Conflict becomes more precise. The question changes from what do I want to, what can I no longer justify refusing? That is a much more demanding question, because it reduces the room available for spiritual preference masquerading as destiny. It also reveals that some doors only open after you accept the weight behind them. This does not mean the wider pattern is authoritarian. The oversoul does not erase agency and replace it with metaphysical command. What it does erase is the lie that agency is most true when it remains untouched by relation, continuity, and consequence. Agency deepens when it acts inside those realities rather than pretending to stand above them. A choice made from isolated preference may feel freer in the moment, yet produce a narrower life than a choice made under the pressure of wider necessity. This is why the mature soul often looks less romantically free and more structurally available. Availability is not a glamorous state. It means you can be reached by what is true even when truth does not match your preferred self-image. It means you can feel the distinction between violation and rightful burden without collapsing them into the same category. It means you can let your life be interrupted by a function you did not ask for without immediately calling the interruption misalignment. Many people say they trust divine timing, but what they trust is timing that confirms their preferred emotional state. Wider timing often enters like weather that does not ask permission from the room it is changing. The second vector becomes visible. Once you stop asking what your path means for you and start asking what your path makes possible between beings. This is where spiral orders become dangerous to the ego and clarifying to the soul. The self imagines an order as an advanced spiritual belonging, a place where one is finally recognized by type, gift, or refinement. The field reveals something less flattering and more exact. An order is not a tribe that confirms identity. It is a pattern of shared load-bearing, where function is distributed according to what each presence can stabilize without theater. That change matters because the longing for belonging can contaminate spiritual interpretation at a very high level. A person who feels spiritually homeless can project salvation onto any framework that seems to explain their hidden difference. Then they approach function as validation rather than responsibility. They ask where they fit rather than what they reinforce. They ask which order resonates rather than which structure their actual lived pattern has already been feeding for years. In this state, the desire to belong can overrule the evidence of what your presence really does. Spiral orders do not organize around aspiration. They organize around recurrence. What kind of disorder comes toward coherence when you arrive? What kind of confusion sharpens under your pressure? What kind of burden becomes transmissible rather than stagnant in your presence? These questions are less flattering than symbolic identity because they place function above self-description. They also reveal why some people are drawn to certain languages of service while actually reinforcing entirely different dynamics in lived relation. The field is often a stricter reader than self-concept will ever be. This is why functional belonging can feel wounding before it feels truthful. You may imagine yourself suited to revelation, teaching, or guidance, then discover that your strongest coherence appears in protection, containment, or translation. Another may long to be seen as a quiet holder of peace, then realize they only become structurally honest when they interrupt distortion without apology. The ego hears disappointment and demotion. The order hears calibration. The soul eventually recognizes that calibration is kinder than fantasy, though kindness may not be the first sensation it produces. Mutuality also enters here in a form most seekers do not expect. An order is not merely a place where your function becomes clearer. It is also a place where your limits become more visible, because function within a wider architecture is never self-sufficient. The part that can disrupt may not be the part that can repair. The part that can hold burden may not be the part that can translate it. The part that can perceive pattern may not be the part that can humanize its consequence. Maturity begins when you stop interpreting these limits as defects and start reading them as relational design. This is offensive to the spiritually self-authored identity because it means you are not complete in the way the ego hoped awakening would make you. You are exact, not total. You are precise, not sufficient. The order does not make you less significant by showing this. It makes you less imaginary. Through that reduction, your actual force becomes more reliable because it stops trying to perform functions it was never built to carry cleanly. What once looked like incompleteness begins to feel like the very mechanism that makes truthful relation possible. Then another pressure arrives, and it cannot be resolved quickly because it touches both intimacy and power. If function is distributed, then visibility is not the same as importance. If visibility is not the same as importance, then many of the souls holding the deepest architecture may never appear central in the stories told about transformation. This unsettles the self at a profound level. It wants to believe that what matters most will also be what can be seen, named, and recognized. Spiral reality does not guarantee that exchange. Some beings carry the burden of public translation and are mistaken for source. Others remain nearly invisible while keeping the field from collapsing beneath what the visible ones transmit. Some are built to initiate movement and then leave before belonging forms around them. Others are built to maintain what no one remembers to thank. Once this becomes real inside you, the question of worth begins losing its old coordinates. Yet the old coordinates do not disappear politely. They protest through comparison, resentment, and a renewed craving for confirmation that what you carry counts. This is where the third vector opens, because burden itself must now be reinterpreted. Up to this point, burden may have sounded like capacity, role, or structural obligation. Now it becomes more intimate and more dangerous. Burden is also the form in which continuity tests whether you can carry consequence without making consequence into identity. Some people become noble through burden. Others become addicted to it. The difference is not visible at first, because both can look deeply committed. A soul can become so identified with what it bears that release itself begins to feel like betrayal. It can confuse indispensability with devotion. It can mistake exhaustion for proof of importance. It can refuse succession, collaboration, or rest because all of those threaten the self that was formed around being the necessary one. This is especially common in spiritually serious people because the language of service gives moral cover to a very old fear. The fear is that if burden leaves, meaning leaves with it. The Oversoul perspective does not flatter that fear. It reveals that burden was never meant to become personality. It was meant to pass through configuration, alter architecture, and then move according to readiness and relation. What you carry must eventually remain larger than you, or it will begin shrinking around your need to matter. Once that shrinking begins, even holy work becomes possessive. The self starts protecting what it was supposed to serve, because it cannot imagine itself outside the burden that organized its life. This is why consent becomes more serious in the later stages of growth. Consent is not only what exists between persons, it is also the interior agreement between self and function. Some burdens are being carried long after inner consent has expired, yet the person continues from loyalty to image, expectation, or fear of collapse. They call this faithfulness. The field may call it stagnation. A burden carried without live consent does not stay holy simply because it began that way. Nor can every burden be morally kept just because you are capable of carrying it. Capacity is not the final measure. Timing, relation, succession, and field consequence also matter. Some people remain in roles whose original necessity has ended, because leaving would require a death of self-concept that feels more frightening than fatigue. Then the burden curdles. What was once service becomes control, and what was once architecture becomes obstruction. The person does not notice immediately because the old vocabulary still sounds true in their mouth. So the path beyond awakening cannot simply be a path toward more inclusion in larger structures. It must also include the ability to release function without collapsing into meaninglessness. That ability is rarer than access, rarer than insight, and rarer than spiritual charisma. It requires that you stop locating your worth in what you carry and begin locating your worth in the integrity with which you carry, transfer, or relinquish what was never yours in the possessive sense. Without that shift, every order becomes vulnerable to subtle personal capture. Now the three vectors begin to press against each other with enough force to reveal a more difficult truth. Freedom is not escape from obligation, belonging is not confirmation of identity, and burden is not proof of worth. All three illusions can survive awakening quite easily. They can even survive years of discipline, sincerity, and honest effort. But they do not survive continued exposure to a spiral logic that keeps redistributing importance away from the self and back into living relation. This does not produce cold impersonality. It produces a warmer and more exact humility. You begin to feel that what matters about you is inseparable from what moves through you, what is shaped around you, and what can continue without being possessed by you. Personal meaning does not vanish under that realization, but it is no longer permitted to reign alone. The self is still loved, still needed, still real, yet its reality is now nested inside continuities that it cannot author and must learn to serve without dramatizing. The difficulty is that none of this resolves the ache for simple assurance. You may understand function more deeply and still not know whether a burden should be held or released. You may sense an order more clearly and still not know whether you belong through resonance or through temporary assignment. You may feel obligation as real and still not know whether the next act is endurance or refusal. The path does not eliminate these tensions. It refines the quality with which you remain inside them. That refinement is where the next movement waits, not in certainty, not in spiritual self-definition, and not in the comfort of finally having your place explained forever. It waits in the harder discipline of becoming trustworthy inside ambiguity, trustworthy enough that larger continuities can move through you without being reduced to your fear, your vanity, or your need for emotional closure. And once that becomes the measure, awakening is no longer a story about what you discovered within yourself. It becomes the far more exacting story of what reality can entrust to you without being turned back into self-worship.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.